En podcast fra LPO Arkitekter. Welcome to the Byggekunst podcast. My name is Alexander. Today I'm speaking with Matthew DL. Matthew is an architect and has his background from Canada and London. He now has his own practice in Oslo called Atelier Dalziel. And on this episode we talk about Matthew's approach to architecture and materials specifically. Matthew's name and practice has come up several times on the podcast, and in this episode he goes through a lot of things leading up to his most recent and maybe most famous project, which is House for a Forest. We also discuss a lot of his other projects and other stuff that he's done, and these days he's also opening a new project or practice called Matera, together with Andrea Pinochet out of Groma. I will provide links to Atelier Dalziel and also Matera, and you can find that under this episode wherever you listen to it. This was a really fascinating and illuminating and very inspiring talk, I think, and I'm really grateful for everything that Matthew is doing for Norwegian architecture right now, at this moment. Yeah, so I hope you enjoyed this conversation as much as I did. So here I give you Matthew DL. Can we just go?
So we're good? Okay.
Yes, I'm here with Matthew DL. No.
DL.
DL. It's a hard name to intuitively know how to pronounce from the way it's written.
That's for sure.
Yeah. So the thing is that I listened back and your name has come up 3 times on 3 different episodes in this podcast. So that's quite a high percentage of mentions, but it's always pronounced differently. I think.
Well, Norwegians pronounce it they mispronounce it very elegantly.
Yeah.
If it's mispronounced in English, it's horrible. It's Dalziel.
Yeah.
But in Norwegians tend to say Dalziel, which is
Dalziel.
softer, a bit closer to the intent. But
is it French or
no? It's Scottish.
Yeah.
So it has this extra silent letter, which used to be a yiel. Yeah. So I think in Gaelic you would say like Dalziel or something like that. But yeah. So if you go to Glasgow and look in the phone book, there's 30 pages of us, but elsewhere, far fewer.
Because I think we're just going to start a bit with your background. Obviously not Norwegian. What's going on? Where are you from? Why are you here, and so on?
Yeah. Well, first I want to say thank you for allowing us to talk in English.
For sure.
I've been in Norway for 5 years, and that's long enough to learn a language, so I have to always apologize for these things. But the context is, of course, it's been... I've led a little bit of an insular life these 5 years between COVID lockdown and one of the projects that we'll talk about today, which has kind of hermited me a little bit. So, jeg kan snakke norsk, men ikke så mye. So, I'm Canadian. I grew up in and around Toronto. My father was a house builder, so that's a big piece of context into how I ended up doing what I'm doing now. I think it's a nice story to tell for young people trying to find their way in the world. I actually dropped out of high school when I was 15 because I was just really unhappy in that space, and I was really clear that I just got a tremendous amount of pleasure and calm and clarity out of making things, and I just wanted to do that. So I left and I apprenticed as a carpenter.
With your father's?
No, first with my uncle, who's also a house builder and a very, very good carpenter, my mother's brother. And then I started working in a furniture making studio, making oak furniture.
Nice.
And then I put my thumb through a table saw. And then I had like some months off while I was recovering from that injury.
You look intact.
Okay, yeah, cool. It's pretty intact. And that moment of pause led me to realize that I did really want to study architecture, and in order to do that, I had to suck it up and do some academic work. So I went back to school and studied architectural technology, which is architecture without the academic aspect of it. So how to produce construction drawings. And understanding detailing for all of the disciplines of electrical, plumbing,
I guess what
structural, this kind of stuff.
Teknisk tegning in Norwegian.
Yeah, teknisk tegning. Yeah, how to be a useful dude in an architecture office, basically.
Unlike the rest of us.
No, it takes time for the rest of you.
Yeah, it does, for sure.
So then funnily enough, do you remember SARS?
I do.
Yeah. So
that's a while ago too.
That's a while ago.
Pandemic or two.
SARS happened and it hit Toronto really hard. Yeah. Not actually, but in terms of press, in terms of publicity, the World Health Organization made Toronto a hotspot. So the economy crashed just as I was kind of looking for work. No. And I'd never been to the UK before. I'd never been out of Canada before, except a few trips to the US for holidays. Mm. So I jumped on a plane and went to London. I have some family there. We're third generation Canadians, second generation Canadians. So so I could get a British passport. And I arrived in London when I was 20 with a return ticket for 3 months. And I stayed until 2019.
Yeah. Until the next pandemic.
Life just happened. Yeah, exactly. Well, it was actually Brexit. It wasn't the pandemic that led us out and also other life things. But so London is really like my adult home. So it's funny when people ask me where I'm from, I'm inclined to say I'm from the UK now because I feel much more at home there than I do in Canada. It's been a long time since I've been a Canadian, but every time I open my mouth and I say something like house, then people know where I'm from.
Yeah, that's a giveaway.
So I say British Canadian, I guess is the answer. And then...
but you practiced in the UK for several years.
For 17 years. Yeah. So I arrived at a time when tuition fees were still pretty low, but they were going up. Mm. You know, the generation before me, maybe 2 generations before me, education was free in the UK.
Oh, wow.
And now it's £9,000 a year for an architecture student, maybe more now. Yeah. So I also count myself extremely lucky because if I had been 1 generation younger, I don't think I could have afforded to go to school because I was also paying international fees. So there's some politics there to discuss as well about the possibility of people being able to afford education.
And I think it's the same price if you're a foreign student coming to Oslo now, for example, to study architecture.
Well, in the UK, it's double. You basically pay double. So I had to pay double whatever the home fees were for my education. And that meant, in a kind of a good way, in the end, it meant that I had to work all the time. So I started working in an office when I was 20, and I worked all the way through my studies. Nice. First, I started studying part-time and working full-time, and then I realized that I could actually study full-time and work full-time at the same time because there's enough air in there if you're determined enough. I mean, I had no life.
No.
I was working in an office of this kind of scale called Reed Architecture, and I basically lived there. I worked all night on school and worked all day on office stuff, and I was drawing airports.
Oh, nice.
Which is kind of oddly at odds with my politics, but very interesting, complex projects, which are actually, later I started working on theater buildings, and they're quite related to theater. You know, they're actually just like a sort of performance piece in the sense that they're always open and they're always under construction. And there's very little space in the performance for error. You have to keep everyone rolling.
There's this very strict line between sort of public or audience and actor, and sort of you have these lines in an airport as well as you do in a theater as well.
Yeah, and also that like most of the building is just a theater set, right? There's this kind of infrastructural piece, which is the big shed, and then everything inside it is constantly moving, and you know, over my life it's been moving for 2 reasons. One is that airports have been transitioning into becoming shopping centers. You know, the world duty-free serpentine path gets longer and longer, and I worked on lots of projects where we were simply trying to get a few extra shop fronts along the road. But and then the other thing is security, because of course, like in those years working on airports,
was it mid-2000s-ish?
This is 2003 to 2012 I was working in that practice. And then towards the end of that, I really realized that I sort of found myself in relationship to the London architecture scene through studying. I studied at London Met, which is the school where Adam Caruso and Peter St. John and Tony Fretton and Stephen Taylor and many others. Florian Bagel was the kind of maybe the kind of professor who directed the culture there most, and it was totally luck that I ended up in that school, because that was the school that offered a part-time course. Because I think if I'd had any possibility, I would have ended up going to the AA or the Bartlett. And I learned very quickly over the next few years that sort of parametric blobitecture world was not one that I found that interesting. It was very seductive. I remember going to lectures because our office was around the corner from the Architectural Association. So I went to many lectures at the Architectural Association when Zaha Hadid was teaching there, and also Foreign Office architects who were teaching there. And it was a good experience to sort of take a bath in that culture. And I certainly, in the noughties, learned Rhino and was working in MicroStation and got my skills up so that I could make lots of doubly curved surfaces. It was really hot then. But I was very grateful and found a home with this certain school of kind of contextual modernists like Tony Fretton and Stephen Taylor. Because I really love this idea that you can be a contemporary architect in a way which transcends and includes the past, that you can draw really deep learning from the past. It's not just that's old stuff and this is new stuff and we have to invent something that has, in a way, no context. So history is important to me.
And I think also on that note that sort of recent history is also becoming more relevant. I think maybe it's in the context of this office, as it's 43 years old or whatever, so it has a long backlog of projects. And so now, like this Friday, we went through this. We had a lecture to the entire office about this project that was done in '94, I think. And there's so much to learn, even though it's 30 years ago. But there are so many things that we can do now.
Jesus, is 94 30 years ago?
I know. But it's something I think a lot of time when we talk about architecture history, it seems like kind of these sort of the parts of our history that we sort of left behind, and we can look back at it now. But there's so much of recent history that is more sort of operational, and that we can sort of bring into today's practice.
Yeah. I mean, what comes to mind is that there's, I think, in our contemporary moment, there's a lot of confusion about the differences between product design and fashion and architecture. And one thing that seems clear is like when you look at an Mark I iPod, there's not much to learn from that, right? The limitations on that project were like, we're going to have an operating hard disk with some sort of interface on the front of it. There's not much to learn from that now in terms of like device production. But an equally vintage architecture is still so rich, as you're saying. So it's architecture is different in the sense that it's a cultural project which has the capacity to be timeless in its teaching. And I think that will always separate it from, I mean, maybe not so much from fashion, because of course fashion we also learn much from.
But it feels more flowing in fashion. I did a podcast with Jan Digerud, who is this postmodernist. Well, he would not admit to being a postmodernist himself, but
that's too bad.
But him and his business partner had an office called Jan og Jon, and they did a lot of like just pristine postmodernist
like
projects.
Sterling style.
Yeah, kind of more like towards like Venturi kind of playful
stuff.
Okay, and we talked for hours, trying to get on. I tried to get into talking about postmodernist architecture, but he just wouldn't have it. We talked about like just architecture in general, and like playfulness and like all these other things that make up the postmodernist style, maybe. But there was so much. There seems to be so much to learn from that now. It seems like there is some. It's kind of coming back and having its moment to a lot of people now, I think.
And I think, I mean, one thing I know we're going to get into a kind of environmental discussion in a moment. One thing that I think is really important for me to say, especially in these kind of contexts, I know in Norway there's a debate between like modern architecture and classical architecture. For me, this is like I agree with both,
Right.
but that's because what I disagree with is the idea that there is somehow a conversation there between two separate things.
Yeah, same here.
And what I can say is that all of the concerns that I have for how architecture operates in the world as a political, social, and environmental world-making practice, none of those things are deterministic in terms of style. You could make a hardcore neoclassical building, which does a lot of good in the world in terms of environmental, social, and political activity. And equally, you could make a postmodern building. So we can have a style discussion.
Yeah,
I could have a style discussion with anybody.
Yeah.
And I would always keep it separate. Like, it's up to you.
Yeah.
What are you interested in?
Yep.
That's something else.
I think we're kind of on the same page on that. That sort of everything is architecture, and it's just to be dogmatic is to be it's kind of be lazy. I think, and it's boring. And
it's a funny thing when you look on Wikipedia. They make these kind of graphs about episodic and with architecture, you see all these kind of styles of architecture over time, and the latest one is sustainability.
As a style.
Sustainability, the style. I mean, there was like BedZ and this kind of British high-tech intersection with sort of eco wind cowls, and you could say there was a style, but the idea that sustainability is a style is really, really problematic because it means that it's somehow inaccessible to other people.
Yeah, and it also opens up to sort of post-sustainable architecture style,
right?
Which is
exactly
scary in itself.
Yeah. Although I'm quite for post-sustainability. We can talk about that.
Yeah, I was just thinking about sustainable architecture style. I think about the Snøhetta Tower in Nydalen, which is kind of maybe the best example of it in Norwegian context.
Of post-sustainability?
Or maybe just sustainability.
Okay.
I don't know how to describe it. But then you lived in London until 2019. Right?
Yeah. So I worked at after I left Reed Architecture and finished my studies. When I did my master's, I was lucky enough to be part of a course which was called the Free Studio. No, can I remember what it was called? I think it was called the Free Studio. My gosh. Robert Mull was my professor, and he's gonna, if he ever listens to this, he'll be ashamed that I can't remember what the studio is called. But the principle was that he was chair of the architecture school at that time, and so he taught a studio where instead of being under the wing of an architect who was teaching a studio in the kind of traditional way, that you would come with your own project. And he, along with Peter Carl, who was the kind of history and theory professor, would guide you on your own project. So for my first year of master's, I studied with Stephen Taylor, who's still a good friend.
Is not the singer in Aerosmith, right?
No, not the singer in Aerosmith, but a very good British architect who also practices in France now, and who was one of the kind of first of that school of British architects to really be able to bridge historical. I mean, he basically reinvented the arch.
Nice.
You could say, like, a lot of his projects have they're very, very, very playful, and I often remember walking around Bath with him on field trips, and he would sort of point out details from these 18th and 19th century houses in Bath and say, that's where I got the idea for that project from. That's where I got the idea. So he was very good at showing people how you can look at a historic detail and take really like the DNA from that detail and bring it into make it your own, write yourself into the story of that expression, which is a much longer tradition. So I really am grateful to him. But then in the final year, I studied with Robert Mull and Peter Carl, and the project was my own house because I was a carpenter and because my father was a house builder. I always had this thing like, of course I'm going to build. I'm not going to buy. So I, just as a hobby, really, like when I absolutely could not afford it, I was already looking for gap sites in London and sometimes making bids just for fun, just like playing the game.
Yeah.
And eventually I managed to find this site, which was in London, the classical architecture site for architects is these what they call an end of terrace site. So it's like you have a row of Victorian houses on a residential street, and then maybe you have another row of residential houses on a residential street or a high street here at 90 degrees to each other. And because it's really like stamped out, house garden, house garden, house garden, the garden of the corner house ends up being having a frontage on the side street. And so like that famous David Adjaye house, for example, the black one with the vertical slot window, that's a kind of classic infill house. And there's many, I mean, they're almost as common as these kind of architect rear extension projects that you see every young architecture office do. So I managed to find a one-bedroom flat, which was the rear extension, so like the servants' quarters of a bigger Victorian house. And because the house had been converted into flats above and a shop on the corner on the ground floor, the rear extension, this is the bit of the house that would have had water originally, right? So it was the kitchen and the toilet.
Oh, I see.
Or in fact, the toilet might have been outside originally. But you see this in the 19th century very commonly, that you have this kind of bit that's attached to the back of the house, which is like the services. So that bit was 20 square meters on the ground, 2 stories, so 40 square meters in total. And then it was sold with the back garden, but the back garden was this end of terrace site. But because the guy who was selling it was selling the apartment and not the land, he just saw the land as a problem. So that I basically got the land for free.
What?
And I got the apartment at a very, very cheap price because it had been built in 1850 without insulation, without a cavity in the brick wall, without any foundation. And over the 20th century, what had happened is that a cycle of tenants had tried to resolve the problem of damp by injecting the bricks with chemical damp-proof solutions and putting cement plaster on the inside of the bricks, which is, of course, the worst thing you can do because then the water gets into the brickwork and it only has one way out. Yeah. And it had a big north-facing. So it was a mess, but it was an interesting mess because it was a mess that told the story of the construction industry forgetting about how living materials and mineral-based, what we call natural materials now, operate, because there had been a big energy shift, right? These houses had been built in a time when there was a coal fire or a wood fire in every room. And so when you have that, you have this radiant heat, which is just pushing the moisture out all the time. And as long as you keep those fires going, it's no problem. But as soon as we switch to gas boilers in the UK, then you have convection heat coming from the radiators and you have a damp problem. Yeah. So I got this house very cheap. And then I made
in London,
in Hackney, so in Lower Clapton, so 5 minutes from Hackney Central Station.
Nice. And
it was just before the Olympics, so I bought it in 2010, and the Olympics was 2012, of course. So it was also this moment, like when I arrived in that neighborhood, the street there, which is called Lower Clapton Road, was nicknamed Murder Mile, and all the pubs were closed. And of course, actually, the day that I went to look at the flat, 2 things happened. One is that somebody defecated in the garden while we were there with the estate agent because it was open to the road. So that was like introducing me to the neighbors. And the other one was that the only remaining open pub was raided by 2 big police, like a SWAT team in 2 big police vans because they were selling cocaine over the bar. So it was an exciting neighborhood.
Welcome to the neighborhood.
Yeah. But perfect. This is what a young architect's dream, right? You move into a rough neighborhood just at the beginning of, I became a gentrifier.
Yeah, so someone has to do that
job. Someone has to do that job. It's also, you can also reframe that as kind of urban repair.
Yeah.
But so the project for the studio first became building a micro house because I couldn't afford to repair what I'd bought, and I couldn't really live in it. So then I figured out that instead of paying a year's rent to live somewhere else while I refurbished it, I could spend a year's rent building a micro house. So I built a 18 square meter timber building for £10,000, including tools.
What?
And put it in the garden behind a temporary construction hoarding, and I lived in that cabin for 2 years without running water and with electricity supplied by an extension cord.
Wow.
And the second year of that.
That would shape the way you look at the world, I guess.
Well, for me, it was kind of like it was the perfect hybrid because I've, growing up in Canada, I'm part of Canada's version of Hutta culture, and so I'm, and it was also like a shared artistic project that my dad and I have. It's like the art of designing small cabins. So I loved the project of it, and then it was very interesting to design that small project with someone like Peter Carl, who has like a very deep. Mythological and philosophical mind for architecture. So I made this little ladder that went up to a sleeping platform, and then I lined I put a window at the top of the ladder. So as you were climbing the ladder, you looked out this window, and across the street there was a Victorian church, and so I lined this window up with one of the windows on the church and stuff. So he dubbed this ladder, which was just a ladder to my bed, he called it the Ascent to Holy Jerusalem.
Wow. Nice.
So there was a lot of myth making and meaning play going on in the creation of this 10,000 pound little cabin. So that was fun. And the second year I lived in that cabin with my now wife, Cecilia Sachs-Olsen, who's Norwegian. She's a professor at Oslo-based now. And that was probably one of the hardest years of our lives because she was finishing her PhD and I was trying to refurbish this house for us so we could make a life there, and we were living in this little cabin, and it was more than she signed up for. That's for sure to say. It was like an architect's dream, but not an architect's girlfriend's dream.
No. Can realize. Yep.
So she's not an architect. So that project, first the cabin and then the restoration of the this Victorian house, it really introduced me, or maybe I could say reintroduced me to biogenic materials and the process of designing buildings that breathe, that are vapor open, you could say. I actually built a straw bale house when I was 16. So I had some relationship to kind of, that was the sort of 90s eco-enthusiasm in Canada.
Are these the kind of circular sort of round plan, and then you have straw and clay?
Yeah, it's straw and clay, but it doesn't have to be round.
That's just my image of it.
No, the one we built, there's you can build with straw bales. The most traditional way is to use the straw bales structurally. So you just build them up with bricks, and then you make a plate on top of the walls. Say it's a rectangle. Could be round.
Could be.
Let's say it's a rectangle. The one I did was rectangular. And you make a top plate on top of the straw bales, and then you use a wire and a fence puller, and you basically sew the foundation to the top plate through the straw bales, and then you compress them together to try to take some of the ductility out of the straw. And in doing that, by compressing them, you don't need to then have additional timber structure to take the vertical loads, but you can only build one story that way. Once you go to 2 stories, you need to have a post and beam structure or a stud wall structure in there. Anyway, so there was some kind of prior knowledge and also sort of eco concern. I used to chain myself to trees in old growth forests when I was younger. So, but I had kind of forgotten about all that and taken a deep dive into urban culture and London culture. So working on this house was kind of rediscovering a part of myself and really enjoying the thing that happened by accident on that project was that I very naturally was like, okay, I need some wood. It would be fun to try to find a forest rather than go to the local building yard. So then I wanted to use British larch, and I found a wood mill in Wales, actually. And then, you get a relationship with someone who's keeping a forest and has a mill, and he sort of like, I made my order and he milled it up. This was for the little micro house. And he sort of drove through the night and arrived at my house at 6 a.m, and I made him a coffee and we unloaded it. And then I had, you have this full story, these beautiful trees, which were maybe not quite dry enough, actually. Yeah. Beautiful planks of wood, which then I also planed myself, which was a crazy idea. But this is a very romantic project. It was just like, I just want to experience the whole thing. I would have gone and cut down the tree if I could, but
did you ever go to the forest beforehand, or?
No, I actually never visited that forest or that mill. But it introduced me. So there was the one ingredient of that project was that it introduced me to what the sort of the real positive benefits that grow out of having a deep engagement with material, which are a relationship with the material, but also a relationship with the humans that are producing those materials, which is so easily missed in this sort of hyper-capitalist mode of architecture, which is where we're basically shopping for products that are pre-tested and pre-certified, and we don't really know where they come from, and often don't really know what they're made of, and certainly don't know where they're going to go afterward, and all this kind of stuff, which you can so easily insulate yourself from. But I found you could also so easily expose yourself to if you wanted to be exposed to those things. So that was one thing that happened on that project. The other thing that happened on that project is because I was building it myself. I was there every day, or at least every time I was working, and there was actually a construction hoarding, this kind of plywood temporary wall around the yard. But I put a big set of doors on the front, and every time I was working, I just opened those doors.
Oh.
And so it became like theater in the sense that everyone who walked past, and it was a well-trafficked pedestrian street, kind of popped their head in. I was like, what are you doing in here? You know. So it was like an artist studio, open day. Every day I was working there. And then so that introduced me also to this, when architects get involved in the making, it opens the construction site. And it's not just architects. You could also, of course, entrepreneurs could also do this. But we have this habit because of health and safety and security and these kind of really legitimate concerns. Of course, we have a habit of taking pieces of city and cutting them out of the city and then replacing them and then putting them back into the city by putting up these walls. And so I think it's very interesting to think about how public participation in construction can also happen just through making the performance of building something which is a bit more accessible.
But it's a good point too. I just recall it was during COVID and it was lockdown and everything. One of our building sites in the city, became occupied by this illegal rave party.
Okay.
And this is in the middle of the city. And it just speaks to the point that it's actually disconnected from the city in such a way that you can have a big party in there with loud music. And of course it's locked down and everything, but yeah, it seems like it's just a different place and it's taken out of the city. You can go in there and you can do anything and no one cares.
Yeah.
It's a strange little...
Yeah, so and then the other thing that happened on that project, which is I'm sort of sowing seeds for the conversation we're going to have in a minute about this house in Oslo, is that I really came to grips with this issue of heat and moisture and air quality, because what we had to do in that house was, in order to make it healthy to live in, safe from a structural perspective, and energy efficient and all of that, was basically remove all of the 20th century building materials from the building. So this was a 50 square meter house in the end, over 3 floors. We removed 70 cubic meters of waste from a 50 cubic meter apartment. I calculated that the other day because I knew how many we have in the UK. It's called a 14-yard skip, which is like the biggest steel container that you can deliver an house. So I asked ChatGPT, like, how many cubic meters is a 14-yard skip?
And this was just like dead material that had been refurbished.
So it was the floor slab, which was actually just like this much. Sorry, I'm saying this much into a podcast. 3 centimeters of concrete over a kind of low density polystyrene base on earth.
Right.
And then also several layers of concrete plaster on the inside of the bricks, the insulation from the roof, the old internal walls, and the kitchen. I mean, we just gutted it, basically. Yep. We just removed everything that wasn't from 1850. And then I actually was offered a grant to insulate the brick walls with this crazy product, which was foam insulation, like squishy foam, not rigid, but
like mattress
some
foam?
kind of some kind of like polyethylene mattress foam with a fiberglass back on it, and the idea was that you basically screw it to the bricks, and because it's a bit squishy, it goes in and makes, and then it's moisture closed, right? And this is the solution.
Because of the carbon glass fiber.
Yeah, and then you
That's-
plaster directly onto the glass fiber.
Yeah.
And so in one sense, this is a brilliant product, because what they're trying to do, if you're just focused on energy, you're improving the U value of that wall substantially by doing that, even if it's just 2 or 3 centimeters of foam. But on the other hand, it's absolutely insane, because what you're doing is making this vapor barrier, which is a kind of modern method, which has all kinds of implications in terms of the building physics, which aren't addressed because they're just thinking about energy. And this was, I was going to get a grant from the British government to do this. And I looked at the material and I was like, I am absolutely not doing that.
Because it would just kill
Because it would have just caused the same problem again.
Yeah.
So what we did is we lime washed the bricks. So we just ended up with this kind of lovely texture where we sort of repointed the joints with sand and lime, and then they were just white with a kind of that sort of lovely chunky texture that you get. And we put in a heated slab and a wood stove. We insulated the roof with sheep's wool insulation, and took out, except for the original timber structure, then we put in oak floors and birch plywood cabinetry and that kind of stuff. But it was, so basically we just replaced all of the 20th century stuff with breathable stuff, where I also knew the supply chain of all of those materials. And what happened was that we made the building, in terms of building physics, it became a vapor open, a capillary open building again. And having the heated slab and the wood stove meant that we didn't have a moisture problem. You know, black mold doesn't kind of accumulate on lime plaster because it's pH. And also the wall is breathing all the time. So we made it back into a healthy building by developing a relationship with these old materials. So those are the kind of 3 things: the performance of the theater aspect of it, the breathing materials, and then the connection with makers and material supply chains, which were things that I wasn't getting in professional practice as much at that time. You know, that was 2010, so it was before I started working at Howarth Tompkins, who are also, you know, the Howarth Tompkins were the ones who started Architects Declare.
Yeah.
So they're very much on board with this project that I kind of associate myself with, I guess, at a bigger scale. They're a big office now, 70 or 80 people. But then I joined a friend called Smith Mordak. They were
Not a good name.
They were then called Maria Smith, but they are now called Smith Mordak.
I see.
And Smith was one of the founding directors of a practice called Studio Weave, with their then husband Jay On, and I went to school with them. So they're old friends of mine to university, to architecture school. And so Studio Weave and that sort of small artistic end of architecture and 00 is where Jay is now a director as well. Were always part of my culture in London, and then they split, and Smith joined Webb Yates Engineers, who are the ones.
I was nerding over them yesterday.
Yeah.
So beautiful.
Yeah, so Steve Webb is fantastic. He's a brilliant engineer, and he's the kind of engineer who also has this insane creative spark. And so he works very well with architects because he enjoys doing unconventional things. And one of the things that he is a very old friend with Aman Taha, whose practice is now called group work.
Yeah.
And they have had a career-long collaboration on most of Aman Taha's projects, and they together, I think, have sort of started developing this relationship also with the stonemasonry company, and started looking into structural stone, and that's a project which is still going on. They're now building a structural stone high-rise in London. And you've probably seen the office and home of Aman Taha, which is this Clerkenwell Green project with the exposed stone on the outside. So what happened was that Smith and Steve and Andy Yates, the partners at Webb Yates at the time, Smith joined them and wanted to start this project to make an architecture office which was transdisciplinary, by which the distinction between multidisciplinary and transdisciplinary is that multidis is like you have an office where you own structural engineers and you own architects, and maybe they sit under the same roof. But the idea with transdisciplinary is that it's really crosses. So the architects are doing structural engineering and the structural engineers are doing architecture. And we also introduced building physics into that as well at that time. And so it was a new experiment in trying to react against this problematizing relationship that often we have with engineers, unless you happen to have a very close collaboration like Stephen and Amantaha had. It's often like architects will come up with an idea and then the engineer will solve it.
Yep.
So it's this kind of, you call in someone to
make it work.
Yeah. And we thought it's very much more interesting to try to make a project where all of the disciplines are sitting around the table from the first moment.
Wow.
So we made this practice and it was fun. It was, first it was just the two of us. It was like 2 architects and 50 structural engineers. So we had their like insurance package and competencies so we could bid for bigger projects, but it was just 2 of us. And then eventually we were 6 architects. Yeah. And we did, the most significant thing we did in those 4 or 5 years that we were together, was to refurbish the Hoover building, which is an Art Deco classic.
Yeah. I saw. Well, that's probably when I was nerding out over Webb Yates yesterday.
It could be.
I saw this reference project.
Yeah. So it's the original Stovsugid Hoover Stovsugid factory, which was it's a classic Venturi decorated shed, right? It's just a concrete shed, but then it has this drippingly wet Art Deco facade on the front.
It looked like almost like neon lights.
Yeah, all that. And so we managed to win the project to turn that building into 66 apartments.
Whoa.
Because we were just like this small architecture outfit, but we had this and really the thing that sealed the deal was that it was Webb Yates' kind of creative engineering solution. From the developer perspective, the problem was that the building wasn't structurally sound enough to deliver the number of apartments they wanted to put in it. So what we did was, with Steve, make a proposal to replace all of the concrete and steel reinforcing that other teams had said was necessary with a lightweight timber frame. So basically this relatively lightweight concrete structure didn't have the capacity in the foundations to take extra weight, but also needed to be stiffened in order to take this new program. And so we made prefabricated stud-work structure where all of the internal walls of the apartments were structural. So it was this kind of honeycomb system where normally you would just have the party walls as structure and you would try to span. So we just said, well, if you actually make more of the walls structural, then we can make this much lighter weight thing. Yeah. So that was a fun project.
That's clever.
And then what happened was we made a proposal for the Oslo Architecture Triennale. Smith and I and her.
And this was probably Triennale in
2019.
Right.
So the bid was 2017. And it had been a conversation around the office for a while that while we were excited and satisfied with the sort of pushing the industry with this transdisciplinary idea, that we were still coming up against the problem of capitalism, right? Where in London, as an architect, I sort of say in my most dark moments that I gave my 20s and 30s to the London property speculation market, because I spent so many hours, days, months, and also like sleepless nights making drawings for people who had no intention of doing good in the world. They were just skimming profit off of the city. And so we wanted to have a conversation culturally within architecture about how we could try to have agency in shifting away from this vicious cycle of us basically sprinkling some style onto spreadsheets of capital as a kind of diagram for architecture. This is like the decorated shed has become like the value-driven box that has some
architecture,
interesting facade.
Right. Yeah.
And so we made this proposal about degrowth. So degrowth is interesting because as an alternative to trying to like design an alternative system to capitalism kind of in isolation and sort of hot swap them, which of course is really impractical, an impossible task. What degrowth is talking about is the everyday choices that we can make that just resist the sort of capitalist running wheel. So questions like, what is better shared than owned became really interesting questions for us. And what we wanted to do was just have a kind of broad conversation with the architectural community of the world, because it was like an international triennale, about, what does architecture look like? I think the question was, to the contributors in the open call, was what does architecture look like when thriving matters most, not growth? Because when you tune into it, it's one of these weird things in the world which is every day talked about uncritically and just assumed as though it's a kind of law of nature. 3% growth per year forever. Yeah. It's a really and you hear it on the radio all the time. We have to attend to it. And it's like, that's like equivalent to if everyone was just talking about avoiding death as a normal, because of course growth and decay, life and death, this is what makes healthy living systems. So so we made this proposal for the Triennale, and that's how we ended up in Oslo. Because my wife Cecilia, she is from a theater background and an art kind of performance art background, and we invited her to join us to do this project so that we could really we had this idea that we wanted to make an architecture festival that was more like a theater festival than an architectural exhibition. So the National Museum was transformed into a library. Like, we dressed it up as a library, but also it performed like a library. So all of the things in the exhibition you could borrow. So there was 80 contributors, some of them quite high-end contributors, like Thomas Saraceno, his Aeroscene Explorer project, which is a kind of backpack that you deploy and it becomes a solar-powered air balloon. You could borrow from the museum. And there was also fun little things, like you could just borrow skateboards from the museum, or you could just borrow these kind of kits for urban interventions and so this kind of stuff. So the intention was that it was playful and performative in a way that architectural exhibitions normally aren't, that we wanted people to really engage with it. And then there was also audio walks, and there was a theater performance by Rimini Protocol at the National Theatre called Society Under Construction, where the audience are participants in the performance, and the performance is about the complexity and crisis of contemporary construction. So there's like the audience members get to see what it's like to be effectively modern slave labor. They told the story that, okay, you've come to Norway to work and you've had your passport taken away. Yep. This kind of and then also you get to be a property developer who's making high stakes bids, and it's all very. If someone's interested in that kind of stuff, they should look at Rimini Protocol. It's a fantastic theater production company. So that was the Triennale.
I remember that. I'm trying to think back to those, because I get the Triennales mixed up in my head. But I remember all that limits. I actually sent an email also to Jørgen Randers. Oh yeah, yesterday.
Did you?
Inviting him
literally
here.
yesterday?
Yeah, okay. Yeah, because I want to talk more about limits to growth, and I remember his talk at Architecture Dagen in 2019.
Yes,
and it was just brilliant. The way he's so precise, and he has so much confidence in his transition movements.
He's very controversial as well.
Yes, and I think it's just, and he said that he would debate anyone at any time, and he was certain he would win. Yeah. And I think with an attitude like that, he deserves to be here as well.
Yeah. He's a fantastic person to speak to. And we had him. He was very involved. We did a kind of pre-Triennale conference in London, and he came and spoke at that, and inspired and horrified people equally, I think.
Yeah.
And then he was also involved in the Triennale here.
Yeah, because I think we met.
Yeah,
then. I think Amandine introduced us.
Oh yeah, do you know Amandine?
Yeah, she was my teacher. Yeah.
Oh yeah. Okay. So Amandine was responsible for the Ahu Summer School, which was part of the Triennale. So she was one of the first people that I met in London. They're fantastic.
She's great.
And people. But maybe the reason to talk about the Triennale, apart from saying that we still think that mode was interesting, was our surprise about the reaction that the Norwegian press and the Norwegian kind of architecture scene had to the Triennale, which was we experienced, and this wasn't, of course, unanimous. There was other views, but one of the views we experienced from the kind of architectural community was this Triennale doesn't have anything to do with architecture. Yet again, some foreign kind of highbrow architect academics have come in and are talking about stuff which is not relevant to us. Why are we sponsoring this Triennale? Why are we going to this exhibition like this? And then the other one, which came maybe more from the press, was just like that it was this sort of nihilistic thing, whereas like I think I gave a tour of the library, which was the National Museum of Architecture, and one of the things I said in the tour was that doing this work about architecture and degrowth had been kind of explosive to my own practice, and I meant in a kind of productive way. And I said that I'm not sure how to return to practice after doing this project. Again, I meant that in a kind of productive way. And I think the quote in the press was like, even the curator doesn't know how to use the work of the Triennale. And so that sort of energized me because...
Oh, that's good. A lot of people could become like, okay, let's get back to London immediately.
Well, I have those days. But and recently, like really recently, I've just really decided to commit to being here.
Nice.
So I'm trying to avoid those days now. But what, and this is again, I'm just laying seeds for what happens next, because then I got the opportunity to. Well, I heard about this PhD by practice call at the School of Architecture, and when applied for it. No, sorry, I should go back a bit and say first. The first thing that happened was that I started to teach at Aho, which is something that kind of often happens, I think, or has happened in the past for curators, that there's an opportunity to sort of do a Triennale studio. So I first did an elective and then taught a studio, and the elective, I called it Being Tectonic. And in fact, then the studio was also called Being Tectonic. And this was my attempt to try to answer the question of what does this have to do with architecture? And the title comes from a kind of play on Timothy Morton's book, Being Ecological. And so he's a kind of modern philosopher who writes very engagingly about contemporary topics. And his Being Ecological book, the point of the title and the thesis of the book is really, we have had the habit of talking about, when you hear the words being ecological, most people think that that's like a niche interest. It's like you would think, maybe we should be a bit more ecological about how we think about this. But what he's saying is, no, being ecological is a kind of a priori state, right? We are all ecological. You can't not be ecological. Your body is a multi-species biome. And so he talks very interestingly and sort of in almost a creepy way about how when you start to try to figure out what part of you is you and what part of you is bacteria. A multi-species biome, it gets very weird and hard to define, right? So I thought this is interesting because so when I finished studying in London in 2012, I started teaching at the Kingston School of Art with someone called Jonathan Wolfe, who passed away 5 years later. We taught together for 4 years. And I learned a lot from him about teaching and about architecture. And one of the conversations we had at some point, I remember, was about how all the words we use to define structural relationships in architecture. So we talk about stress and tolerance and movement and tension. Thank you. These are social words, right?
Yeah,
and so this idea of being tectonic is like, okay, so in the same way that we are all already ecological, the idea that the tectonic arts, which is somehow the heart of Baukunst, that the tectonic arts are this autonomous practice of assembling building materials and the beauty of connection between a beam and a column or whatever, that the idea that that should be an autonomous practice is slightly weird, and that we can be tectonic as practitioners with other things other than our building materials. We can be tectonic with the city. We can be tectonic with each other. So it was inviting the tectonic arts to expand its definition of the art of connection into the art of connection with environment, the art of connection with society, etc., the art of connection with politics, indeed just the art of connection. Because so there's a scholar, an indigenous scholar in Canada called Dwayne Donald, and one of the things he talks about a lot is how colonialism is extended. He says it's the extended project of disconnection, and therefore colonialism is not just something that happened to, for example, the indigenous people of Canada and the U.S. and of course other places, Australia, India. But colonialism is something that somehow happened to all of us. That modernism as a longer project, the sort of 500-year project, has been unintentionally an extended project of disconnection. We atomize our social structures. We disconnect with where our food comes from, where our building materials come from. We now disconnect with each other increasingly by kind of connecting with each other on social media. Going to become so I became interested through this being tectonic frame about how to talk about how the total culture of architectural practice and making could be an outward-reaching tectonic art form. So that was the teaching project. And then I got this opportunity to do the PhD by practice at Aho. And coming back to I said at the beginning, we were talking that I was into the idea of post-sustainability. So my original proposal for the PhD was titled Architecture After Sustainability.
No way, yeah. There you go.
And the idea there was that sustainability has become, so since this Cradle to Cradle book, which was probably 25 years ago now or something like that, when William McDonough and Michael Bronhardt defined sustainability as 100% less bad.
Yeah.
Right? It's not good in any way. It's only 100% less bad. I think someone else said, sustainability is one step away from being illegal. It's not aspirational at all. Yeah. And also because of all of the ways that it's been captivated by different motivations, it has become a kind of meaningless word. And I also think now, unfortunately, you see this with circularity and regenerative as well, that a lot of the kind of practical uses for the idea of circularity have become about recirculating toxic assets. We have endless aluminum and plastic windows that people are trying to reuse in projects. And of course, it's very important to think about resource supply chains, including reusing materials. But I think it's equally very important for us to think about how we will live in a world where there are no toxic assets. So that's really what is meant by regenerative practice. But regenerative practice can only happen after restorative practice. If you follow the kind of the project set out by the regenerative movement, regenerative practice is a long way off.
Right, so because you have to change out everything that is...
We have to restore. Right. We have to repair all the damage we've done first. It's a little bit like CO2 in the atmosphere. Like we have to decrease the amount of CO2 we release, but we also have to deal with all the CO2 we have already released. And so there's a healing practice that is a big project that we're only just starting with, that happens before the regenerative practice comes. So I always get a bit, uncomfortable and worried when I hear words like circular and regenerative floating around as though they're just synonymous with sustainability. Yeah. So that was the idea with the PhD, was to go in, try to answer the question of the Norwegian public, the challenge that the sort of press gave us, like what relevance does this Triennale really have? And then also to answer the architectural criticism, which was, this doesn't have anything to do with architecture. So I wanted to use this being tectonic frame and the idea of how an architectural practice can start to do the work of world making that imagines into being a world after sustainability, recognizing that sustainability is not enough. So that's what I've been up to for the last 4 years. But a big part of that time has been about building this house up in Uppsala in Östersjö, because it coincided. We sold that little house we had in London,
Became billionaires and
became absolute billionaires, and then used all of those billions to buy a plot of land, and we're dirt poor again.
That's the way it is.
That's the way it is. I was rich in quotations for a week, I think. So we bought a plot of land there because it was a very beautiful plot of land, and it was where Cecilia's family were. So it was kind of moving into the street of the family somehow. And that's, of course, a very privileged position. I want to own the fact that, this project has been made possible, of course, by a lot of hard work. And, it didn't start by like a big seed donation from inheritance or something like that. It started really with, of course, a little bit of help from family, but not, but really with a lot of hard work and benefiting a lot from that moment of buying a site in East London just before the Olympics in a kind of rough neighborhood that then became what now seems like the center of the world.
But it's still, I'm taken to sort of kind of hero's journey stories that you have this kind of Walden situation where you live in this tiny cabin in this dirt street, and it
was a bit Walden.
From there, it just grows into what it's become now.
Yeah, I mean, it's.
I think it's beautiful.
I wouldn't say it's a hero's journey yet.
It still ended yet, so.
We're a long way from the end of the story, but So what happened was that I got in when I started. The nice thing about a PhD is the first couple of years of a PhD, at least the first year and sometimes more, are really just spent reading. Right, you just need to dive into whatever world you've said you're going to dive into. And so I spent lockdown sitting on this empty site, which wasn't empty, it's a forest basically. And I started gardening, and I was reading all of these books about what's called post-humanism. So it's a philosophical.
Is it related to Arne Næss?
Eco philosophy.
Yeah.
It's somehow it's in the region. For sure. So one kind of branch of posthumanism is what we call transhumanism. So that is a kind of posthumanism, but that is very much this enthusiasm for technology and for perfecting the human subject as a long project. So it's like humanism 2.0. So what they mean when transhumanists talk about posthumanism, what they mean is a human that has become a post-human because it's so perfected that it's something other than human. So it's very much a humanistic project, right? And I started to read about that, and then I started to realize, this is interesting, because when you look at architects like Norman Foster or Zaha Hadid or others, you see that the discourse of sustainability within architecture is very much transhumanist. There's a problem with the world, or there's a problem with our impact on the world. We are separate, by the way, from the world, nature, culture divide, right? I'm saying as a transhumanist. And we are causing a problem which is threatening us. And so we need to solve that problem in nature with technology. And so this whole idea that, sustainability, as we talked about, like the style of sustainability, like photovoltaic lenses and maybe wind cowls and really just tech. So the architecture can remain this autonomous art, and then we can resolve sustainability with an environmental engineer or a building physics engineer. And in the same way that in Terabang, which was the name of the kind of trading name of the architecture firm inside Web Yates, we were called Interrobang. It's this punctuation mark, which is an exclamation mark and a question mark in one.
Of course.
So it was a bit like WTF OMG. We should have just called ourselves WTF OMG.
Yes. With an exclamation mark.
But so what we were looking at it in Terabang was this problem, like trying to avoid this problematizing and separating of architectural practice from structural engineering practice. And then when I saw that in transhumanism, it helped to explain why sustainability had always been this externality to architectural concern. And I think you still even today, although it's changing very quickly, I think still even today, you see this idea that like, oh yeah, there's that, but like we don't, it's like talking about budgets in architecture studios.
Mm-hmm.
It's boring and it doesn't really lead you anywhere. The point is to learn about Baukunst.
Mm-hmm.
So we don't talk about the environment somehow.
Yeah.
And of course, there's a lot of it going on now. So I'm not saying that's still always the case, but it started. So that transhumanist side sort of gave me some context. It's like, okay, so we can say sustainability in architecture is actually a transhumanist philosophical position. So you could give some clarity to the history of philosophy that relates to that way of thinking. And so then it was a question of, okay, the other type of posthumanism is what's called critical posthumanism, which comes from feminism. And there, what we're doing is saying that women and people of color used to not be considered human.
Mm-hmm.
Animals are not considered people. Plants and fungi are not considered people. We have this nature-culture divide between, effectively, at some point, pretty recently, white men and the rest of the world. Mm-hmm. And so what critical posthumanism does is basically decenter first that white man and then all man from this nature-culture supremacy that we have, and starts to ask questions about how can we be in the world? How do we think about the world? Ontology. How do we think ontologically about the world in a way where humans are not the center of the world? Mm-hmm. And so then I was like, okay, this is interesting because.
But then you're not replacing anything with the human in this image of the world, right?
Just taking human off this pedestal that we've put ourselves on,
right,
where we're separate and other and better than nature.
So it's kind of veil of ignorance kind of way of.
Well, it's in the most simplistic terms, in the most reductive terms, you could say this act, very bizarre act of putting ourselves separate and other to nature is the source of all of our problems.
Yeah, I see what you mean.
And so the question of architecture after sustainability, what is the kind of what world do I want to imagine into being through my work? Then I have a destination, which is this critical posthumanism. And then I, in the PhD work, I started to ask, if I know what a transhumanist architecture looks like, what does a critical posthuman architecture look like? Yeah. And it's very, very hard to find examples. But because I had started to do some gardening work on this site while I was drawing the house, I ended up doing a course during lockdown in what's called food forestry, which is a practice of planting perennials instead of annual plants, where you're not tilling the soil because the plants are coming back every year. And then the food resources that you're taking from that system are the fruits and nuts that come from the trees and vines, etc. And it's the oldest gardening practice because it predates modern agriculture. So it has more to do with hunter-gatherer ways of being, where of course hunter-gatherers weren't just finding some berries and eating them. Mm-hmm. They were also getting to know plants and moving those plants from where they found them to where they lived, and kind of inadvertently producing what an ecologist calls a biodiversity hotspot. So around their home, all of these beneficial plants growing. And they're not beneficial just to the humans, they're beneficial also to the animals. And so like indigenous peoples who talk about food forestry practices will often say like, we also don't have to go anywhere to hunt because the animals we want to hunt just come to us, right. So it's a kind of making human, it's a cultural project, right? Which is neither nature nor culture. It produces a thriving life ecosystem which benefits many species and really, produces a thriving life ecosystem. So,
but it's us using our cleverness to make it so. Kind of.
Yeah,
but so there isn't design aspect
for sure,
to this,
for sure. And this is, I think, thank you. It's a very critical point, which is, I think, the danger when we talk about conservation and environmental concern is that because we're still operating in this thought space of us being separate from nature, we think in order to stop harming nature, we need to remove ourselves from nature. Yep. And I think this is very sad. And also wrong, because of course what we need to do is actually do the opposite. We need to write ourselves back into nature and remember how to do good within that space, because otherwise we have no choice but to follow Elon Musk to Mars. And that's the transhumanist perspective, right? Which is, moving to a planet that has absolutely no critical factors for life support from a place that we're destroying. It seems very weird.
Yeah.
So
seems to be this movement that starting again is actually better than trying to repair what's going on right now.
This movement that is
just it seems to a lot of people it seems to be a better idea to just start over.
Oh yeah, grass is always greener, clean slate. I mean, it's a key teaching of architecture, this kind of tabula rasa approach. Start with a blank piece of paper, and then we can design a solution as the kind of detached orderer. But this is very much the white man logic. So that's the kind of space that I ended up in while I was drawing this house.
Nice.
And so I thought, okay, this is interesting. So what I'll do is plant a food forest in this site before the house arrives, and then think about the house project as an introduction to the food forest in the same way that I introduce a nitrogen fixing plant or a fruiting plant or a nutting plant, that you introduce it into an ecosystem where it has waste streams and energy needs and an impact, it's part of the system. It's not trying to write itself out of the system. It's not trying to be 100% less bad. It's trying to be 100% good within, with its neighbors.
Yeah.
And so that was the kind of brief for the project. Became it. And then all these tools of making connections with materials and people who make materials, performing the act of construction for the public who experience the construction, the people who walk up and down the street. The theater part. And then also the breathing materials part. So all these ingredients from the London house became the starting point for this house here. I am going to perform an alternative way of being through this project. And it is going to be, in the sense of an art project, a one-off. It doesn't need to be an example of how we should do things. It's really just an energetic offering of possibility. So in that sense, there's space for hypocrisy, right? You can say, I am still participating in the property market. I am still consuming building materials, which I buy from the building industry. It's not perfect.
Right.
But you can start with some kind of conceptual backbones, which is no concrete, no plastic, no blasting, no cutting trees. And that before we start the project, we will increase the biodiversity of the site, and also through our own relationship to the site, make it valuable. So one way to think about that is I worked for several years at this office, Howarth Tompkins, where we were taking care of yellow and red listed buildings. And you arrive as a transformation architect or a restoration architect or a conservation architect into those environments, recognizing the thing you were arriving to not as a blank piece of paper, but as something with tremendous value, which your job is to help to extend its life by acknowledging a need for a change of program or an improvement in energy or whatever. But you're making with something. You're making with this existing theater. So I thought, okay, this is interesting. So I'm just going to arrive to this site as though it's a red listed building.
Yeah.
Not as a kind of blank piece of paper where the only thing that controls what I do is the Smalhuusreguleringsplan. So these are kind of games, right? These are kind of creative games, which they're not going to save the world, but by setting up these kind of creative games, it means that there's a possibility for a kind of artistic project which has something to say about the world in the end.
And it's also it's a sort of creating a sense of framework and some kind of guidelines that didn't exist before, and through practicing and trying to push those frames and whatever, you're slowly getting towards something. It's kind of a new practice.
Yeah, I mean, I think the thing I'm trying to make clear is that I don't want anyone to think that I think that I have the answers and this project is the way that we should all be doing things. Like in the way that some years ago Norman Foster was like, I do sustainability. I've done it. Yeah. What? What do you want? So it's very much in the spirit of the kind of theatrical interest that we had from the Triennale and how I discovered this through the project I did in London. the power of performance, the power of artistic projects, much more. And I said this the other day when I was doing a talk at Null, that I think, so Deleuze, modern philosopher, he had this whole discourse on creativity, and he talks about how information controls the world, and it's a controlling force rather than a freeing force, a force of emancipation. And his conclusion is that the way that we change the world, the way that we act critically in and productively within the world, must be through art, not through information.
Yeah.
And so I think this also has something to say to the kind of way that architects think about sustainability, because you often end up in these conversations where it's about like, okay, what does the EPD say?
Right.
What, how much CO2, how much energy, is
values.
it BREEAM Nord, the U values and stuff. And that stuff, I'm not saying that stuff isn't important, but if we only follow information, we're going to get exactly the same kind of quality of stuff that we get out of that we get out of social media for our souls. Like knowing how many footsteps you've taken because you wear a digital watch, this quantified self world, it doesn't really help us.
No.
And so I see like this thing about like U values and carbon and blah, blah, blah. It's like, I'm not saying it's not important, but I'm saying, what about art? Because what about helping ourselves to think differently? And so that's how I see this House for a Forest project. So the project is called House for a Forest.
It was there on the Oslo Open House?
It was there on the Oslo Open House. It's not finished, but it was there, and we were very grateful for all of the interest we had. I think 300 people through the house.
So much good stuff.
It was so lovely for us because it has not been an easy project. Emotionally, financially, it's not been an easy project, but it's so lovely to have so much interest in it. And also thank you for inviting me here to talk about it.
Absolutely.
But
you're going to live there, right?
I live here now. We moved in 6 months ago.
Nice.
And we're trying to finish. So it's actually a double house. It's a 3-bedroom house, which is split vertically. So one side of it is a 3-bedroom house with 3 bedrooms on the ground floor and living spaces upstairs. And then the other side which is smaller, is a garage and an entrance. And then above the garage, there's a small apartment.
Yeah.
So it's actually it's almost 50 square meters. It's kind of 1-bed flat, and the idea is that we're going to rent that flat in the spirit of. Do you know this project in the UK called Experience Architecture? So Peter Zumthor did a project for it, and MVRDV did a project. Holiday homes designed by architects.
Yes.
So the philosophy of that project is to make. It's actually the developer is Alain de Botton, who's written several kind of pop philosophy books. But he had this idea that a lot of people don't get the opportunity to live in contemporary architecture. So he wanted to make projects where people had the opportunity to see like what's the difference. So we wanted to. One thing was that the property values, and this is where like when I say it's an artistic project, and therefore there's space for hypocrisy within the project. This is one of the things, right? Which is like, we bought a really expensive piece of land. I'm not uncomfortable to tell you that it was 4.5 million kroners. And we bought it off market, so it would have been more.
For sure.
And in that context, we could have built a micro house. We could have built a 20 square meter cabin and lived in it, but it would have been...
And the Walden thing again?
Yeah, but it would have been... we would have lost money, because so you also have to live in the world where you live.
Yeah, no. But I think this goes to the point, like, of everything else that we've been talking about, like the dogmatic sort of that you're sort of integrating somehow finances and sums and art and thinking that one is a problem for the other. Like, it's not really about that. Like,
we have to tangle them up, or just admit that they are tangled. They just exist, exactly. So we thought, okay. We want this to be a kind of critical performance of alterity. This is a conversation I'm having with Cecilia. And so how are we going to make this house the size it needs to be, which is now it's 180 square meters, 100 square meters on the ground. How are we going to make a house of this scale, which is really more than we need? We're 3 people. We have a 7-year-old daughter. How are we going to be critical towards that while also doing it? And I think it's very interesting, this history of these kind of villa neighborhoods that after the war, it was forbidden to build single houses. So this toemansbolig type arrives. So this was a very interesting thing to, and also I learned a love for the double house from Jonathan Wolfe, my teaching partner, who made a very important house early in his career called Brickleaf House, which was a double villa for two brothers in Hampstead in London. And he subsequently did another kind of.
Oh yeah,
you know it?
yeah.
Yeah?
Actually, I found it on Google Earth
Mm-hmm.
like months back, and it was just there, and it looked great. And I started googling what that could be.
Yeah.
And so I just stumbled upon it in one of my sort of Google Earth
Okay.
explorations.
Yeah. So it's called Brickleaf House, and of course the double villa type has a very rich history in architecture. Maybe the most iconic one, which maybe people don't often realize, is the Venetian palazzos are double villas, right? Because they were originally built as merchants' houses with a storage level and then an apartment.
Mm-hmm.
But then when the families grew, they just built another floor.
Right.
So they're actually family apartment houses where the whole kind of parapet line of Venice went up.
Oh.
I think twice, actually. So when you look at those palazzos, they're actually layer cakes over
That's
time,
interesting.
not just, And so they're double villas. And so I've been very fascinated with this idea of the double villa. This house, the way that it's drawn, the idea is that it can operate as a house and an apartment, or a single house, or a house and a drawing office for a young architect, a middle-aged architect. And so it operates in that zone where it can be many things. So that was our way. We're going to build at this scale, which is more than we need. But if we're going to build at that scale, we're going to make sure that it is complex enough in the way that it works that it can be many things to different people. So that's how the house works. And then the reason maybe people have been interested at first in the house is because of this grand statement that it's the first hempcrete house in Norway.
Yeah.
I mean, hempcrete has been around for a long time, so it's no big claim. But it's an interesting.
If it's the first hempcrete house in Norway or the first hempcrete house since,
hempcrete is a new thing. Hemp, of course, is an old thing, but hempcrete has about 30 years of history.
Okay.
So I have been saying for several years that it's the first hempcrete house in Norway, and no one has corrected me. But I'm very, very open to the possibility that there are others. I think at this point I'm pretty confident that there aren't, because I know the European supply chain of hempcrete pretty well, and if someone had built a hempcrete house here, it would have been built by someone that I know. Yeah. At this point. But so, I mean, the story of how we came to hempcrete is interesting, because we started just with these ideas that I talked about, and specifically in terms of kind of construction philosophy, that instead of being a vapor closed house with a ventilation system, that it was going to be a vapor open house with, and along with vapor open comes really instead of using machines, what you use is thermal mass, right? So you have thermal inertia that's brought to you by stone or bricks or clay or something dense that's vapor open, so that it can absorb this warm, wet air and hold heat. And then when the house gets cold and dries out, it can release it again. So, the way that works is the peaks and troughs of temperature and moisture outside are quite extreme and quite fast. And if you have breathing materials and thermal inertia, then the internal comfort is much slower. Yeah. And that's why buildings in hot countries that are made of earth or stone are very comfortable in the summertime. And it's, the climate in Norway is, of course, quite different than that, but it's not a system which is irrelevant to this climate either. And so, we started with this idea of no concrete, no plastic. And at first, I was very interested in using dowel laminated CLT, so massive trä, where instead of nails or glue, you use hardwood screws, basically. Because that is a massive wood structure which doesn't have glue, so it's vapor open, because even the glue in CLT stops it from breathing as much. And it happened to be that as those thoughts were emerging, and also I can say that
Is that, I'm just thinking about the CLT. Is it also a cold bridge issue that you use dowels instead of like metal
Oh, you
screws,
still have
or-
to insulate it. I mean, in fact, you don't. You can make a massive wood house without any insulation, and there are companies that will provide DLT solutions where it's really just like a wall which is like 30, 40, 50 centimeters thick solid wood.
Yeah, that does it.
That does it, right?
Yeah.
I think if you like put it into a U-value calculator, you need something like 60 centimeters of Gran to get 0.18 to get Texan. And I think in an architectural tectonic way, that's a sort of delicious perversion, right?
Yeah.
It's like, oh, that is
Love
so
it.
thick and good. That is like fantastic windowsills and thickness and depth. You know, we love that. Cast a good shadow. So I started looking into that, and I was excited because my approach that I learned from these guys in London, Stephen Taylor, Tony Fretton, was to be modest and to really write yourself into a story which you first have to understand. And so it took me all of my adult life to really feel like I understood British architecture and that I could make contemporary work in the UK that felt like it was doing that work of writing myself into a rich history that I could say I understand. And so I'm a newcomer to Norway, right? So it's like another ingredient to this site was like, how am I going to make a project here? What can I learn about this place? And so one of the first things, of course, you notice, you go to the Folk Museum and you see these stabwood, and they're fantastic, weird architectures, right? There's so much interesting food there. I love to think about someone like Valerio Olgiati walking through the Folk Museum and getting so much architectural food from that, and then being able to make fabulous abstract things. So I got quite interested in, it should be a timber building. It should be a contemporary building that uses the material of this place, the architectural material of this place. But those thoughts coincided with the kind of crazy spike in timber prices. And I think I literally could have 3D printed the house out of gold at that moment in 2020 or whatever it was, when timber was so expensive.
Went up 140% in 24 hours.
Yeah. And of course, that's interesting to reflect on, because that was happening partly because of monoculture forestry production, right? So again, like the food forestry work that I was doing had something to tell me about why timber to build this house was so expensive, and also in that practice of imagining into being an alternative world, then this relationship with where materials come from and the practices of producing those materials become really important. So yes, CLT. I think that I know there's a lot of criticism for like using CLT for small houses, for example, but I think if we have sustainable forestry practices and the tectonic of that particular project, or in fact the total context of that particular project, really calls for that sort of construction method and material, yes, let's look at it. And in fact, those who have visited the house will know that the structural frame of the house is CLT. So the floors and the internal walls and the roof are CLT. It's a domino house in that sense, so the outside walls don't have any structure. So it's like slabs and columns, structural diagram. So we couldn't use DLT, or I was just started to think about, okay, we want to have these breathing walls. What else can it be? And it could be straw bale. So I looked at straw bale, but the wall thickness has to be sort of 40 centimeters or something. If you're using standard, even if you use this kind of eco cocoon system, which would have to be imported, it was still going to be a thicker wall than we could achieve while not cutting down the trees, because we're really hemmed in between these trees. And then I learned, to my shock, that hemp was illegal to grow in Norway. And
still is, I guess.
And still is. And so the choice to use hempcrete, and I was saying this at Knoll the other day, and I think it's important to point out that there are lots of interesting solutions when you open yourself into this world of biogenic and unfired mineral earth solutions. There are so many possibilities, and it's only exciting to explore the relevance and possible palettes of materials. And there's a whole kind of world of architectural expression in there that I find super energizing in this time of crazy crisis, you can just get excited about all the possible colors that you can make out of earth.
Yeah.
And textures and stuff. There's a lot there. So I'm not saying that hempcrete is the answer for the Norwegian construction industry. I think it's one really interesting answer, but I don't want people to think that I think that, like, again, like this project is the way things should be done. The thing that's interesting about
But at least it's, at the very least, it's one way to do it.
it's
right?
one, and it has a lot of benefits to the Norwegian context, which I can talk about. I mean, the first thing that's interesting is to recognize that it seems from the history that it may be the oldest cultivated plant by humans in general. It has more history than we can follow. Really fantastic histories, like sailors used to have. There are ship's logs from the earliest Portuguese explorations where they're taking barrels of hemp seeds on their ships. And it seems to be that the reason they were doing that is so that if they get marooned, they can grow sails and rope.
No way.
Right? So
What?
because it grows 5 meters in 1 year, and it produces fiber, which is both like the original fiber of rope 6,000 years ago in China, but also it is like an extremely strong, long strands of fiber. So, you get marooned and you need to replace all your ropes and sails. You can just plant hemp and next year weave yourself.
Wow.
So it's really like a fantastic way of thinking about material production. You bring
That just blew my
bring
mind,
you
actually.
bring the seeds. You don't think about. I don't just think about what textile do I need for this awning, or what kind of insulation gives me a U value. You think about what plant, and therefore what seed do I need to have in my logger to make this sort of thing. So,
Wow.
so it brings it back to seeds, which is interesting.
Mm-hmm.
But then it's also this thing that hemp as a material. So for 200 years, Norges Vel, this agricultural vel in Norway, has been writing guidance for agriculture in Norway, because they started at this famine period where there was blockades on transport. And all of their guidance until hemp became illegal said, in order to be a self-sufficient and good farmer in Norway, you must grow your own hemp. And that's because it is an extremely useful plant to agriculture.
And it's also edible, is it?
Yeah, so first it is a soil remediation crop. So it cleans soil and it helps with general soil health. Then when it grows, because it grows 5 meters in 1 year, it sequesters 4 times as much carbon per hectare as a young forest. No, sorry, the same amount of carbon per hectare as a young forest. 4 times as much carbon as other kind of crops, like grain crops like barley and wheat. So you have a super carbon sequestering plant and a soil sequestering plant. But then when you harvest it, first you decorticate it, so you break the woody core away from the fiber. Hemp is related to the hops plant. So hops is what we make beer out of. It is a climbing plant. It doesn't have its own structure, but hemp has its own structure. So it has this woody core. So first you get this fiber, which ropes and sails, clothing, really a big contributor to the history of textiles. And then you have seeds and oil, which have 3 or 4 times as much protein as barley, for example. So it's a superfood. Eat hemp seeds; they're really good. And a cooking oil. Then after all of those things, which are all really beneficial to, food production, farming, all these utilities. Then you have this wood chip, which traditionally has been chipped up and used as animal bedding, as an alternative to straw. But the thing that's very unique about this wood chip is that because the hemp plant is growing 5 meters in 1 year, it has all of this micropore structure, which is very, very good at absorbing and releasing moisture.
Almost like balsa wood, kind of?
Exactly.
Yeah.
Like balsa wood. I'm not sure the pore structure of balsa is so diverse. If you look under a microscope at hemp, it's really very many different sizes of pores. So, and this is what we use for hempcrete. So, I kind of got interested just within the frame of how can I contribute to Norwegian architectural culture by learning about the culture. I got interested in Staburs and traditional, even dragon style architecture. I think is quite great, quite cool. And then also about the agricultural history, and because I think there's a very close relationship between architecture and agriculture, which we must rediscover. But then hempcrete comes into the scene, right? So hempcrete was originally developed in France, I think in the 80s.
Okay, so it's quite new.
Quite new, maybe late 70s. I haven't actually put a date on that. But I've been saying 30 years for probably 10 years, so I need to add a decade to it at this point.
The same thing. Yeah. Everything is 15 years ago.
Yeah, exactly. Watch it. But originally it was developed as a way of insulating limestone buildings in France, right? Because there's the massive stone buildings, like my building in London, an uninsulated massive masonry structure, which if you're going to add insulation to that type of structure, the correct way to do it, the only safe way to do it, is to add a breathable insulation material which can participate in the breathing system that's already there. So use, it's a stone wall made of limestone, pointed with lime mortar. You take hemp chip, you mix it with lime. It produces a kind of almost like oatmeal muffin type of mix, where all of the individual pieces of hemp are coated with a thin film of lime, and then you toss it quite lightly into a formwork. And if you're doing it up against an old stone building, you make a formwork that is maybe 10 or 20 centimeters out from that, and you fill that up. So it's kind of bonding directly to the stone, and
no rebar, no.
No. It's in that application, it's not structural because the stone is structural. Okay, yeah. But what you're ending up with is something which is effectively aerated limestone, because the hemp is filled with air, and the lime becomes limestone again, and so you get both the sort of performance benefits, some of the performance benefits of a thermally massive stone wall. So it's behaving sort of like half like a stone wall, and then the other half like a fluffy insulation wall that we know we need. So it performs, not as well as rock wool or mineral wool or wood wool insulations because it also has this thermal mass. Just in terms of U value, it's not performing as well for the thickness. But then it has this other aspect, which is the thermal mass. So in the end, and this is where it gets interesting with building physics, is that if you look at a wall just for its U value, you're missing all these other opportunities, because a hempcrete wall or an earth wall or a straw and clay wall, they're absorbing heat and absorbing moisture and therefore regulating the internal environment, as we talked about. But also when wood fiber absorbs heat, absorbs moisture, it produces heat. So the process of absorbing moisture, just a little bit, right? Not much, but it just means that these computer models, which are really very black and white, simplistic tick box computer models, they maybe some AI will help us here. We need more if we're going to rely on pre-construction documentation for our construction systems. We need software that can be more experimental, because if we only are able to test for things we already know, then we're in a feedback loop. And this is the problem with hempcrete, is that the literature from European studies on hempcrete in lab environments where they're using more sophisticated software tell us that it is carbon positive because it sequesters so much carbon in the hemp, and then also that the lime is carbonizing. Right. So as the when you activate the lime with water, it's quite violently, it starts to boil in the bucket. It starts to become limestone again, and that process is a carbonization which absorbs carbon. So something like 30% of the carbon that's released is reabsorbed within the first 50 years of the construction, and then you have the the hemp carbon load which it's holding. So the kind of carbon stats are that hempcrete as a material is already kind of quite significantly carbon negative, but I prefer to say carbon positive.
Yeah,
you know what I mean?
Yeah.
Before you use it, and then in terms of building physics, it says that a wall that is just meeting Tech Sutton 0.18 should be 70% more energy efficient than another wall that is meeting that U value.
Yeah, I see.
So in theory, we should be able to make a wall which doesn't comply with Texuten, so has a less good U value, but is still more energy efficient,
Right.
which is the ultimate goal of the U value concern. So this is where, for me, I feel like we're overmining U value and undermining all these other performances that we might want to think about, and really using the wall as the ventilation machine. So instead of balanced ventilation, you have a wall which is absorbing CO2, absorbing VOCs, regulating the humidity, regulating the temperature, is carbon positive, and has been produced. It uses lime, which of course has a carbon footprint, and that's something that is a kind of critical mark against hempcrete. But it has a lot of hemp in it, and that hemp is one season biogenic production material, which has already provided food and fiber and soil health to the system. So you can see how you can kind of get excited about this. And then in the Norwegian context, I think it's very interesting because two of the very good properties of hempcrete, which have made it very popular in places like California where they suffer from fire, is that it's fireproof because it's stone. So you can hold an open flame, like a proper flamethrower, up against hempcrete. And my colleague, Andrea Pinochet, she has a picture from the tests we did at AHU, where she's got her hand on the back of a piece of hempcrete, which is only 6 or 7 centimeters thick. And on the other side is an open flame, and there's nothing happening. Wow. They do these fire tests, and I think after 4 hours, they just turn the machine off, and then they give it a 4-hour fire rating. But in fact, they've never waited to see because it doesn't carry a flame, and and the flame doesn't degrade the hemp on the surface burns away, and it goes black, and that's it. That's the end of it. So a fireproof material is very interesting to an architectural culture that has suffered from fire trauma. Like, how many times did Bergen burn down?
Too many.
Yeah. So, and then the other thing is rot, of course, because when you have a timber construction history and present and hopefully future in a climate which is wet, the rot is also a problem. So I see.
And with quite dramatic temperature fluctuations as well.
Yeah, and one thing that I see as an outsider, as a newcomer to Norway, I think people outside Norway see that Norway has a very rich timber construction history. But when you look at the kind of contemporary timber culture, it's not really that rich. You know, if you compare it to Japanese carpentry or German carpentry, the kind of the skill level and the sophistication of the execution of timber as an art form seems to be, if not lost, quite significantly diminished in contemporary architecture. And so for me, I'm very interested to talking about this idea of like imagining into being and cultivating a history that you want to write yourself into. I think what the kind of work that I want to do in Norway now is one where we try to, a bit like architecture after sustainability, it's like Norwegian architecture after we get over importing architectural styles and materials from other places. So that moment when German neoclassical prefabricated elements started arriving in Norway, and you can see it in the folk museum when you walk around, it's like first we were making cornices out of timber, and then later they just arrive as concrete pieces. And of course we know like Schinkel's participation in Karl Johan and all this kind of stuff.
Then Oslo became more Berlin than Berlin itself.
Sure, exactly. So all this. So then the question is like, in the same way that Norway, and I'm really speaking out of turn here, this is just like what I've kind of learned and become fascinated with. In the same way that Norway had to sort of reinvent its culture after being colonized for 400 years, I see an opportunity in architectural culture to kind of not close its doors, of course, to international conversations about architecture, but really define itself as a place that has a unique architecture that it can also be contemporary. And, you know, if we look to places like Switzerland, then I think you can see that. You can see contemporary architecture where there's a deep respect, understanding, and a lot of DNA in the contemporary work of people like Peter Zumthor and my favorite architect whose name I can't remember. What's the timber guy called? Gian Caminada.
Yeah.
And actually, I would say more Rudolf Olgiati than is it Rolf? Rudolf Olgiati than Valerio. Valerio's made some nice stuff, but I think that his father, in terms of that idea of writing yourself into a history and having a deep fascination with a cultural practice beyond yourself, I think
That's a good deep dive for anyone who's listening who's
Yeah.
not looked into that. Is
Oh,
looking
yeah.
at plans and sections of Rudolf Giatti.
Well, I mean, what you can do is you just look at images of his buildings, and then when you look at the plans, it's just like, what?
Is that a new building?
Yeah. They're fantastic. He's so wonderful. But so I really, that's also then this project, House for a Forest, to come back to that, is there. Like for me, like if you say like who are the architects who I'm trying to tune into with this project, it's people like Rudolf Giatti and maybe someone like John Lautner, student of Frank Lloyd Wright, and it's certainly Frank Lloyd Wright. Because these are guys, of course, they're different generations, but these are guys who are kind of sitting at this border between like myth and story and craft and contemporary architecture. In the way that Taliesin is like this, it's like this saga that he just wrote his whole life. So I'm interested in that kind of space of architecture, and so those are my guys in a way, Rudolf Giatti and John Lautner and that kind of stuff. And then it's like blending that with Stabur logic. So not building with concrete means you really automatically need to minimize ground contact. Also not blasting the stone on a site which is kind of undulating also suggests minimizing contact. So the sort of architectural expression of the house from the street is very much of a Stabur.
Nice.
It's a kind of barn building on legs. And therefore also on the street facade, it doesn't have any windows. So it's a bit like, what's his name? This Austrian architect, Bernardo Bada, something like that. I can't remember. We can anyway. There's another young middle-aged architect who has and like also a bit like Glenn Murcutt, I guess, like has explored this in the way that I'm sort of philosophically exploring the relationship between agriculture and architecture. Something has trickled into this project where it's also like exploring agricultural tectonics in architecture, and that's also because the neighborhood where the house is of course an old farming area, and all the houses are kind of eppiage, bigning infill stuff. And I sort of thought, okay, like maybe this neighborhood doesn't need another house. Maybe it can just have a barn instead.
Right, yeah, or a Stabur.
A Stabur, yeah, exactly. So
I think it's great to have a voice like yours, that especially since you're an outsider coming in and like looking around and see like how can you apply some kind of idea to what you're doing based on your context. And we were discussing, we did another project which was touching on, it was an exhibition project, and it was touching on some like parts from the Viking era, and it's also some Nazi stuff. Like there was a lot of sort of difficult history to deal with in that exhibition project, and we were working with some Icelandic exhibition designers. And they pointed out that in a way that I had never thought of this, that there's the 400 years of Danish rule, of course, of being a colony, and then slowly the Norwegian culture was starting to get back on its feet, and then the Nazis came and took that and perverted that in such a way that now it can't really be used.
Yeah.
And so this Icelandic guy pointed out that he could not really relate to having your entire cultural history being sort of kidnapped. And it's kind of useless to a lot of people. I think in the culture it's sort of...
Or untouchable.
Yeah, and it's become more a cultural dogma more than a sort of... I don't think this is a touchy topic at all. I think it's just became a blind spot.
Do you mean in the sense that dragon style is kind of seen as a fascist architecture now?
Kind of, yeah. I think a lot of people make that connection intuitively. It's just like, it's a part of our history that we are not engaging with now because of several reasons. Among one is that you see all that Nazi ideology creating architecture that looked a lot like Norwegian traditional architecture.
Yeah, so one thing that's interesting about that is going back to this thing I was saying about, you can make a neoclassical building or a postmodern building out of hempcrete, for example. There was a moment, when 3D printing and parametricism seemed to be dictating a certain stylistic preference. But of course, you can 3D print a neoclassical building.
Yep.
So in moments where the stylistic expression of an architectural style seemed to be unthinkable because of some cultural harm that has been done, we could think more about the culture that made them than the style itself. Because I'm not necessarily so enthusiastic about putting like faux dragon boat prows on
No.
the ridge of my house. Although I did play with doing some sort of totemic things on the house. The thing that I think is interesting is really just tuning into, because those buildings were made within a culture of resource management, which was like selective forestry and axe craft and, using wood tar and other natural products which are, those materials are not interesting to me because they're natural. They're interesting to me because they're democratic and local. So one of the things I talk about often when I'm talking about this thing about concrete is lime is better in a lot of ways, but one of the ways that lime is significantly better is that you and I could go out to the back of this building and dig a hole and probably find some and slake it and make so it's a local material which is accessible to small publics. It's a bottom up material, whereas Portland cement is like proprietary, industrial. It's part of this global project of disconnection where products become monopolized by the few and are so complex it's impossible for us to understand them, and also they're the only thing that's available to us. So I don't want to romanticize like pine tar, but also
still, of course it's there.
Like we were talking about, it is an interesting material, and I think it's quite sad that I was reading a couple of years ago that we don't even make enough pine tar in Norway now to restore the old churches. In fact, I contacted Hunton and said to them, "Hey, I think I need to use your bitumen boards on the underside of my house, but I don't want to have bitumen. Why don't we do a project where we like replace the bitumen in your bitumen boards with pine tar and reignite the pine tar industry?" And they were a bit like, "I think that's going to clog up our machines." But these I just think it's there's possibilities there. To
for sure.
Think with pine tar
But I think that's also my point, that having someone like you coming in now and sort of revisioning a lot of these things, it's like, maybe we could just use pine tar. Like it's good to have like one of the good aspects of having sort of a fresh set of eyes on things is that you actually have a fresh set of eyes yourself.
Yeah,
like you're able to like go into that situation and see. Maybe we can do this again, or
Yeah, I mean, I think that was actually the origin of the name Foreign Office Architects. Was they had this idea that actually there's something unique about an architectural practice which is from elsewhere. As long as they come with really good analytical and critical practice, then something. Because, so Richard Sennett has this thing he talks about the difference between. I have to try to make sure I get this right, between barriers and boundaries.
Yeah.
So a barrier is like an impermeable membrane, right? No exchange happens across that path. But a boundary is where evolution happens, like where the sea meets the land or something. Is actually the generator of change is when one thing is exposed to another thing and something new happens. So maybe that's where I situate myself as a kind of foreign office architect.
Right, yeah.
Is that there's something interesting that can happen when I come with my Canadian, British carpenter, eco-warrior, contextual modernist collage that I have in this history of my life story, and try to make sense of myself being here in Ostmarka.
Yeah. It makes for a very fascinating toolbox, I think.
Yeah. And then it's this is like why conceptual art is so powerful, because the more kind of ingredients that you bring to a project, the richer it becomes. And the house is really complex in a way that's almost silly.
Yeah.
Because of all these conversations that are happening. It's certainly not like a prototype for a catalog home.
No, but still maybe someone can take an interest.
Yeah.
I think this is we've actually been speaking now for 2 hours. But I want to also...
What time is it?
It's actually... it's 2:30. So
okay.
Maybe we should round up.
Yeah.
But maybe you could just briefly say something about your new practice?
Yeah. So the question, of course, I spent all winter alone in this construction site working and thinking to myself, what is this amounting to? Maybe, yes, I'm going to get a PhD out of it, which I also still have to write. I've been doing all this building. And of course, I came up around the same time as practices like Assemble in the UK and Studio Weave or old friends, and so alternative forms of practice. And indeed, what we did at Interrobang was, in this spirit, alternative forms of practice which are trying to capture back or discover new agencies for practice. And then one of the practices that was very inspiring to work with in the Triennale was BC Architects and Studies. And so I started to think, okay, well, if when I go to my local builder's merchant in Oslo, I see meat and potatoes, and I want something else. Maybe I need to become a builder's merchant in order to make the projects I want to make. And then if I want, then I can somehow participate in controlling the price, which helps make it available to clients, which is one reason Norwegian clients aren't using these materials, is because they're seen to be more expensive and they don't understand the benefits. So, and then the other gap is craftsmanship, people knowing how to use these materials, because I can have a client who comes to me and says, I like what you've done with your house, which of course is kind of my lighthouse project for future practice. I like what you've done here. How can I do it? If I'm going to make this possible for other people, then I need to make a practice which is delivering craftsman's competency, material supply and architecture as one thing, or as and not necessarily, when I say as one thing, I don't mean like a total service that we will always provide, but really as a kind of cultural enabler for those three things which are so critically important. So the new practice, which we're launching like this week, basically, is a collaboration between me now and Andrea Pinochet, who I've known for several years through AHU.
She was my teacher as well.
And she was your teacher as well. And so we're going to keep our two practices going. At the moment, we're going to, I said to her, we have to sort of date before we get married. Take it slow. So we're going to keep Atelier Dalziel and Groma going for the moment, but we're starting this other thing, which is founded on the basis of those two practices, where we will we're investing in the supply chain. So we're buying materials, starting with materials for making hempcrete and for making clay elements to buildings, both dry board clay products that are very easily integrated into the supply chain in Norway, and wet clay products, which are essential for surfacing hempcrete or straw bale or.
So it's legal to use hemp in that way.
Yeah,
just
for
not
sure.
Legal to grow? Is that?
That's right. No, we can absolutely buy it. I mean, my house is not illegal. Yeah. So we're buying hemp and lime from France, and we're buying clay products from Germany, and we have a storage now. We have a lager, and we hope to have a shop front where we can have a kind of material gallery, so people can just walk in off the street and be first drawn in by the lovely color palette of 146 different colors of clay plaster that we're going to have, but then can be drawn into this world of all of the many benefits of these materials. And so it's going to be this hybrid practice where we want to design projects, of course, of any scale and all types. But we also recognize that we need to, like good gardeners, we need to have good soil and we need to have resources. So one of the things I've written about maybe around this project that I did for the Triennale in 2022 was this idea of the architect gardener, not meaning that architects should make gardens, which of course they should, but the architect gardener as a kind of philosophical position, which is like we have to cultivate the world we want to live in. And so the new practice is called Matera, Matera.
So it's kind of a wordplay on mater and terra.
Sort of. I mean, it's actually the name of a town in Italy.
Oh.
But it's also a combination of material and terra, so like earth-based materials.
I see. I was.
And it's also like material architecture, Matera. It's like all this. And also, I realized that actually,
it's just a good name also.
Well, also just after having an architecture practice with an unpronounceable surname at its core, I needed to have a practice that was like, Latin is a good way of bridging between English and Norwegian.
Yeah.
So that's where it comes from. So so we're going to do that, and we hope the idea also, of course, is that instead of just competing with other architects for a very limited client base of people who are interested in this kind of work, that we work collaboratively with as many other architecture firms as possible to make their projects possible. Wow. So we want to like, we can provide detailing advice, we can provide materials, we can provide craftsmanship competency, so that you and me and Andrea and everybody else can make better buildings.
That's great. That's wonderful.
So watch that space. We're
sure.
going to try to ramp it up as quickly as possible.
Do you have an address and stuff for the storefront yet, or is that coming?
So Andrea has an office in Santitan, and we're going to make a materials showroom space in that office to start with. But we hope very quickly to be on the ground, on the streets, so that it's more public, more performative. You know,
great.
So we get out there in the street with it. We will start also, of course, to make more projects like my house and like the work that Andrea has been doing with her students to show the benefits and applications of these materials, and hopefully show that they're not prohibitively expensive. Because the other thing that comes along with these materials is interest and a sort of dugnad spirit. You know, we with our house, when we did the hempcrete element, we had like more than 25 volunteers.
Oh, wow.
Who were just people like Anna, Rosa, who were just interested and wanted to learn about these materials. And so there's a sort of exchange value, going back all the way to this degrowth concept. There's an exchange value other than money that happens when you start doing things that feel good in the world. Working with materials that are healthy to work with and produce healthy environments and are fun to work with. Means people are just like, yeah, I'll just come and do some clay plaster.
That's great.
So that's how we make it cheaper to start with. The way we make it cheaper in the long run is demand.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's a perfect way to end this. That's really, that was great.
I'm sorry, I'm a talker. That was
great. This is a very difficult, or it's a huge, complex thing. But it's I'm really happy that you're doing what you're doing. It seems like something that we really need. So I'm really grateful for that.
Yeah, thank you for your time.
Thank you for coming, and thank you for listening. Bye. Thank you for listening to the Bygge Kunst podcast. If you have feedback or suggestions to guests or things that you want us to talk about, then you can email us at podcast@lpo.no. And that's podcast with a K. You can always follow us on social media and message us there. And there's one new Bygge Kunst episode each week. And hopefully there will be more episodes in English coming soon. Take care.
Alles ist Architektur.